Hello, friends. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos, where we discuss communication with people who are different than you. And since we're all unique, that's pretty much everyone. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos. Today we have a very special guest I'm excited about, Matthew Zakreski. Matthew is a clinical psychologist, professor, author, and he's a professional speaker who has presented over 400 times all over the world. He specializes in working with neurodivergent people. Matthew, I'm very excited to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, and please call me Matt. I'm only called Matthew when I'm in trouble. So
We'll try to make sure you don't get in trouble today, so Matt it is.
Fantastic.
Matt, can you tell me and the audience, if you specialized in neurodivergent people and working with them, what does that actually mean? Because I've seen a lot of definitions and it doesn't seem clear.
Right. And like any term that gets sort of taken over by popular culture, it gets twisted, it gets reimagined. The best way to think about brains is all brains represent neurodiversity, right? Just like, there's a diversity of plants, right? All the things. But if we're going to talk about plants that follow the rules and plants that don't follow the rules, then that's when we get into the model of neurodivergent brains versus neurotypical brains. So neurodivergent brains are brains that are outside expected thought and behavior patterns. So about 70% of people are neurotypical. Their brains operate basically how we'd expect brains to operate. The other 30% are ADHD brains, gifted, autistic, dyslexic, OCD, and these terms represent, a modern understanding of neuroscience. So we can look at a brain scan and say, oh, look at that. That's what ADHD looks like in a brain, which provides us, I think, a really nice foothold to push back on this, like it's somehow a choice or a parent's fault or somehow TikTok has something to do with it, I think.
Everything.
Yeah, right. So I try to anchor all the stuff I do in brain science because I can say, hey, listen, I can look at a brain and tell you what the differences are. And those differences are way more than just how a kid does in school or how an adult does in the workplace. It shows up how we think of ourselves, how we communicate with others, the kind of jobs we can do, the kind of jobs we can't do. So, we need that brain science to sort of give us a guidepost to how to move forward.
Great. So you mentioned about 70% are neurotypical.
Yep.
And would you say it's somewhat of a bell curve? Some people are far off on one end of the curve and some people are far off on the other. And those are the people who are neurodivergent?
Absolutely. Right. And, if we think about the bell curve in terms of, the world is built for the people in the middle, right? School is built to educate the middle.
Right.
School is work is designed to take care of the most people in the most way possible. And it's an efficient system. The problem is that when you have people who go out towards those tail ends, the systems we've built don't work for people who are extremes. And one simple way to think about it is think about human height, right? Most doorways are about 6'6", right? So if you're 6'10", the world is quite literally not built for you, right? You've got to duck to get through every door, right? And in college, I was friends with the starting center on our basketball team, and he was 6'11", and they had to custom build him a bed so he could live in the dorms, right? Because the dorm beds were not built for a guy who's 6'11", right? So, most people never think about walking through a doorway, just like most people can walk into a classroom, sit down, more or less figure out what they're supposed to do, write the things down, and move on with their lives. But if you're a neurodivergent person, the way your brain and body work may make it a difficult fit or an impossible fit for you to be in those spaces.
I feel like I grew up pretty neurodivergent because, at least in some ways, people never made sense. It seemed like they all had a code book and what they were saying made sense to them, but it never really made sense to me. And so I ended up paying just a lot of attention to what people are doing much more than most people do,
Yeah.
just to try and make sense of the way people were communicating, which I think in the long run has helped me because I've learned a lot from it. But it's a constant challenge for me.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I don't have data on this, but I would think there's a pretty high percentage of podcasters who are neurodivergent, right?
Yeah.
And and it's funny that idea of everybody else had a code book, everybody else like went to some meeting on how to be a human, and you missed it,
Right.
is a common complaint amongst the neurodivergent. And it's actually the title of my book that comes out this year. It's the Neurodivergent Playbook, how to get the code that nobody taught you, right? And it's
Nice.
just, let's break this whole how to be a human in the world thing down. And it's a beautiful idea because there's so much vulnerability in saying, like, why is it everybody else is marching to this one beat and I feel like I'm off this other beat over here? Because the world isn't always friendly to people who raise their hands and say, I don't work that way.
Hmm.
So, I think it's important that we talk about these things, and especially in public spaces like a podcast, to lay it out there like, yeah, hey, I'm probably this way too. And if your listeners are out there, they're probably nodding and saying like, wow, yeah, you know what? I think that makes a lot of sense. If Jeremy's like that, then I think I'm probably like that. What do I do with that knowledge? So,
And it seems to me, and maybe you can correct me, it seems like there are a lot of different dimensions on which someone could be typical or divergent.
yeah.
I use the Myers-Briggs as an example quite often. And one of the reasons I do, and one of the reasons I got interested in psychology is I took a 3-day Myers-Briggs class when I was in high school.
Yeah.
And she used me as an example because I am so far on the ends of the tendencies that I was just fun for her to use as an example because it was so clear.
Yeah.
But it seems like anyone who on any one dimension is off to a side, it makes it challenging.
Yeah. And those people can be seen as the exceptions that prove the rule, right? Because, you enter into conversations like, oh, are you an extrovert or an introvert? Right? Now, I'm very extroverted, right? I'm like near the far end of the extrovert scale. My wife is very introverted. But that is not to say that my wife can't be extroverted, and it isn't to say that I can't be introverted,
Hmm.
right? What I've built a lot of my therapy practice around is this idea of what I like to call third door solutions, right? Our brains naturally like dichotomies. It's, the light is on or it's off. I'm hungry or I'm full, right? I'm sleepy or I'm awake. But in most of those examples, there are gradients between those things, right? And when you train your brain to look that way, you actually gain a lot more flexibility because you're not beholden to these constructs that may not actually fit, right? I mean, I'm not hungry right now. That doesn't mean I couldn't eat, right? If somebody walked into my office with a bagel, I'd be like, well, I'll have the bagel. Who doesn't want a bagel right now, right? And it's this idea of, if you think to yourself, well, I'm weird, that could be a box.
Hmm.
And weird is a thing that is defined by whatever normal is, if normal even exists, and weird would be the opposite of that. But I would argue that the communities you participate in get to tell us what normal is, right? So, yes, if you want to wear your live action role play costume to high school, people are probably going to look at you like you're weird. But if you wore your LARP suit to a LARP convention, people would be like, well, that's just Tim. Tim's just,
Right.
I mean, Tim's an orc, right? I mean, that's just
Yeah.
what Tim does, right? So, I think that so much of success in life is finding your people, your communities, because they emphasize the best things about you and make it easier to develop the communication and interpersonal strategies that we want people to do, right? If you're spending a lot of energy trying to, like, what we call masking, right? Trying to like fit in with other people, it's harder for you to have more energy to tap into those moments of authentic communication and connection.
I like what you're saying. I'm going to go back to your third door option because I think it's a balance. I think it's great to find your community, to find your people. I know when I went to UMass Amherst, and my first semester we lived in a dorm, and it just felt the same as high school, which I didn't love.
Right.
And I'm like, well, maybe this is all there is to it. And then in mid-year, I moved to a different dorm, a whole different area. And it was like a deep breath of relief. I'm like, oh, I'm home. These are my people. It was so wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
But on the flip side, I also do a lot of work with engineers who have become managers.
Yeah.
And that kind of forces them into not just working with their people, but having to figure out how to communicate across groups. Do you have some advice or stories about that?
Oh, so I mean, I do very similar work as well, and it's a thing I like to call the curse of competence, right? Because if you're good at stuff, and if you're an engineer, you're probably pretty good at stuff. Sooner or later, somebody puts you in charge of other people, and I mean, when I teach college students and grad students, one of the things we talk about is just because somebody has a doctor before their name doesn't mean they're a good teacher. It means they clearly have a certain amount of content knowledge, right? But it's the sort of thing where I've had, lay people who were better teachers than doctors because the lay people understood it or could communicate it in a strong way. So one of the classes I teach is about creativity. And creativity, we have this idea that it only looks one way, right? It's the arts, broadly speaking. But you can be creative in coding. You can be creative in cooking. You can be creative in how you dress, in how you problem solve. I mean, creativity can look like anything. And I use that as a map to work with people who are rising up the corporate ladder and say, you don't need to be that stand and deliver manager, right? You don't need to be the agent of transformational change, especially if that's not your comfort zone, right? We start by playing to our strengths. So if you are a concrete communicator, if you're somebody who's like, I need XYZ done by this time on this day, then we start there, and your team will know their expectations. They know where they stand. You'll have meetings. The meetings will be organized, and they'll have probably schedules and timesheets, and we'll all feel really good about it. And we're going to use that to raise your floor, right? So your floor becomes, hey, listen, everyone's going to know where they stand. Everyone's going to know their job. I am a clear communicator. As that goes on, we build more of the interpersonal skills, some of the motivation stuff, interpersonal problem solving. And I think most people, when they get into leadership management roles, is they feel like, just like creativity, it only has to be one thing. You're only allowed to be one thing. I think that's actually where people fail, because they overextend themselves trying to be somebody they're not. So I think being the strongest manager you can is about understanding your strengths and weaknesses, playing to your strengths while working on improving your weaknesses, right? It's not a get out of jail free card. It's not like, well, I'm not good at people, so I'm just never going to be good at people.
Right.
No, life doesn't work that way, right? I've got to learn how to run money if I'm going to run my business, right? So it's the idea is like you start with your strengths and you use that to bring everything else up with you, because a rising tide does lift all boats. We just need to be very intentional about how we approach that.
Yeah, the self-awareness is so key.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, it can go too far where people just shrug their shoulders and say, well, I'm not a money guy. It's like, well, you kind of have to be.
Well.
Or find someone who is.
Right. Well, and that's, it's funny you mentioned that, because to me, being not a money guy myself, I hired an accountant. He's great. But I have to know my stuff to talk to my accountant, right? It's like if you had a great surgeon and you showed up and said, fix me, the surgeon's going to say, well, what do I need to fix?
Yeah.
Right? Oh, you'll figure it out. Just run an MRI. It is fine, right? I think that partnering with professionals whether it's a therapist like me, or an accountant, or a surgeon, or a landscaper, or whatever it might be, requires an awareness of the problem, the ability to articulate that problem, and the ability to co-create a battle plan with somebody, right? And I think a lot of people fall apart between steps 2 and 3. They might know what's wrong. They might be even able to say it, but no plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? I just had someone cut down a bunch of dead trees in my backyard. And he's like, listen, we can only get to so many of these trees. We got to cut down those trees, clear out the brush, and then go back and get the rest of them, right? And I'm like, but I want it done now.
Yeah.
No. So, to be able to navigate those moments is, I'm going to argue, the biggest difference between successful and unsuccessful people is when you get a curveball, when you have an unexpected bump in the road, how do you navigate it internally and how do you navigate it externally?
It's pretty interesting that you're saying that, because going back to the Myers-Briggs, one of the tendencies has to do with how much you like planning things ahead. And when you talked about that party, I was thinking, I don't want to do any planning of anything because I hate the planning part. I love reacting. I love kind of having enough background material that when the situation happens, I'll be able to figure it out when I'm there. Yeah. But I know other people that drives them crazy, and they need to have looked at all of the potential steps and make a spreadsheet and map everything out, and with a plan A, B, and C just in case.
Yeah.
So everyone has their own special way of dealing with that sort of adversity.
Yeah. And I love the word adversity, because adversity doesn't mean bad, right? It just means not what I want. Yeah. So if we only ever do the things we want, we will be satisfied, but we won't grow, right?
I just finished reading David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about near misses and far misses, and he talks about how near misses can cripple you and make it so that you're not going to go back or do a thing. But a far miss, like when something bad happens and you overcome it, just makes you so much stronger, because like in the future, bad stuff can happen or adversity can happen, and I've dealt with it before. I'll deal with it again.
Yep. And I love Gladwell too, and I would even take what you said and tweak it just a scotch by saying bad things will happen. They're guaranteed. Right?
Oh yeah.
If you think about success rates or failure rates as a fraction, you can never make the number on top of the fraction a 0. It's always going to be 1. The question is, how big can you make the bottom part, right? I'm a parent. My kids offer me hundreds of thousands of opportunities every week to get it right. But I can't sit here and tell you that my failure rate's 0, right? Because sometimes I screw up, because I'm human. And if you put yourself in this position that says successful people are, or successful people do, and thus I must be that person, you're not giving your space any wiggle room to grow, to struggle, to fail. Everything involves a learning curve. And it's so easy to look at people and be like, well, they're so successful. Look what they do. And A, we don't see the hard work they put in behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And B, we can't be other people, right? If you spend the time looking at what other people are doing, you're losing a certain amount of the uniqueness that is your journey, right? And, as I enter more into the professional speaking space, it is very easy to look at other professional speakers and be like, I'm never going to be them. Well, I don't have to. In fact, I shouldn't. Right? I would love to have their success. I would love to have their reach and the opportunities. But if I try to be person X, I'm never going to be me. And that's a hard thing to wrap your brain around.
So going back to the topic that we started on, neurodivergence, do you find that people who are neurodivergent are more likely to want to try to be like people in the middle?
in those moments is an opportunity to do one of three things, right? To utterly fake it and act like you love it so you go along to get along, to utterly disengage from it and say, like, this is stupid and terrible, I'm leaving. Or what most people choose, which is the I'm going to navigate the situation as best I can, right? Engaging in the parts of this I like, trying to deconnect from the parts I don't like. But the problem is that you've got to give people permission to have that third option and give them the skills to navigate it successfully, right? You know, the Super Bowl is coming up, right? I love professional football. You know, it's not my wife's thing. Every year we have a Super Bowl party, and every year, well, it was early off in our dating, my wife would try and sit there and watch it, and she would, you know, and a couple of years, I'm like, babe, like, I just want you in the room with us. Like, I want you eating the chips and dip, and I want you hanging out. Like, so now she curls up on the couch with a good book or a craft and like looks up at the commercials and is like, you know, like, oh, very good. You know, and that's a third door solution. Like, that's authentic engagement that she's not spending the energy masking on that, right? So yes, like there are times that all of us, especially those of us who are neurodivergent, have to mask, right? Absolutely. But if you see masking as a means to an end, not a thing I have to do all the time, right? It's got a major benefit for your sense of self and the energy you bring into the world.
Kind of like a crutch. So sometimes you need a crutch because your leg is broken, but it's not something you want to be using for the rest of your life.
Oh, heavens, right?
So,
yeah, absolutely.
As much as you can use it when you need it, and then try to discard it when you can get away without it. So is that how you got into this whole topic of your expertise, because you grew up with it?
Yeah, I mean, I always say this work is personal and professional. You know, I really want to be the adult that kids like me needed. And, you know, I was lucky. Both of my parents are clinical psychologists, right?
Oh, nice.
And so I had a lot of that support. My parents knew what to look for. We had, you know, financially we were able to tap into some of these programs and systems. Not every kid has that. And that's actually what drew me to doing more speaking and consulting, because when you do therapy, you help one kid. If I can talk to a school and say, hey, here's what this looks like. You have 1 million of these kids. Like, let me teach you how to serve their kids. Then I'm helping 2,000 kids, and I'm helping 2,000 families, right? I mean, then, you know, it's not throwing a rock in a pond, it's throwing a boulder in a pond. And, you know, if I have the ability to do that stuff, I feel like I'm obligated to do so. It's lucky for me is that I love doing it. So, you know, but there's still just a lot of misconception out there. There's still a lot of bad science or old recycled myths. And, you know, the more we can push back on that stuff, I think the more we give our kids a fighting chance to not only just be successful, but be satisfied with their lives. You know, live a life that's authentic and meaningful, and, you know, and find spaces in a world that is not necessarily built for them where they can feel safe and feel supported, find their people, you know, and that's what gets me up in the morning, I guess.
I love it. I love what you're doing. And I love when people don't just teach what they're excellent at, they teach what they've had to learn. So if you can be a person who has been in the shoes of the person you're teaching, it's so much more powerful than if you're just someone who's excellent at something and always has been. When you're trying to teach it to someone who struggles, it's just not as effective. So as of the timing of when this comes out, I will have just made a podcast about changing the name of this podcast. So I'm interested in your feedback, and the decision may have already been made by the time this is posted, but I have had it be How to Talk to Weirdos, thinking about the people who are on the ends of those bell curves and how difficult it is for them to talk to the average person or the typical person, and the typical person to talk to them. Yeah. But what I found is not everybody likes the term weirdo. I've tried to normalize it with some success, but I'm thinking of changing the name to either neuroconverse aka talking to people who are neurodiverse, or
Mhm.
neuroconversant, aka talking to people who are neurodivergent and or being fluent in their language.
Yeah.
Curious of your thoughts on either one.
I mean, neuroconversant rolls off the tongue. I think and I love that because to be conversant in something, it doesn't mean that you are an expert in it. It doesn't mean you're fluent. It means that you are able to engage, right? So I would definitely vote for the latter. I think that's a good brand name, and I could see how the word weirdos would turn some people off. I describe myself as a professional nerd, so I'm
Mm-hmm.
probably not the right person to weigh in on. I'm like, oh, yeah, weirdo. Who's not weird? I'm weird. Everyone's weird.
Right.
But I mean, we want to broaden the audience, and I think neuroconversant is a good title. I think people will really respond to it.
Great. That's where I was leaning, but it's good to have your feedback. All right. We are going to start wrapping up, and I've got 3 questions I ask everyone. The first one's part A and B, a place that you have loved to go and a place that you are looking forward to going.
Yeah. So I lived in Australia for a while, and I think basically every day about how to get back there. So I would love to return to Australia. In fact, it's 2024. This summer will have been 20 years since I lived there. So it is time to find my way back down under. And there's a big gifted scene in Australia, so I'm just waiting for one of them to like, yes, you can keynote at my conference. I'm like, yeah, you know. Um, so that's where I would like to return. Where I'd like to go, I've always wanted to get to Egypt.
Mm.
To be able to see the pyramids, the Sphinx. I mean, archaeology is so fascinating, and it's a part of the world I haven't gotten to explore very much. So that would be the top of my list.
Like it. I would love to go to Australia, and I have been to Egypt, which was
Yeah.
fantastic. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist, so it checked a lot of boxes going there.
Well, and a lot of neurodivergent boxes too. It's like yeah, like it was like either marine biologist, Egypt archaeologist, or paleontologist. Like most of us wanted to be one of those 3 things, or in my case, all 3 at the same time. And Batman at night. That was my
Yeah,
plan.
well, of course.
Obviously, right? So,
All right. The second question is, who do you think is a great communicator, either public figure or just someone in your personal life?
so this is going to make me sound a bit like a fanboy, and he hates when I say this, but Scott Barry Kaufman in our field, I mean, he's an incredible scholar and speaker and just general human being. But every time Scott does a podcast, every time Scott does a talk, you know, I really try to watch and listen because I feel like I learn a lot from him. But he balances the humility and the expertise as well as any speaker out there. And, I mean, as someone who is, if Scott is in the 99.99th percentile of what we do, I'm in like the 99.8th percentile. And even with that said, I'm still learning stuff, right? And it's just not only what he knows, but how he sends it out there.
Mm.
So, I mean, Scott, yes, I'm sorry I embarrassed you, but also it's true, and I tell you this to your face. So,
And I'm going to put it in the show notes so it'll embarrass him even more. All right. And what is one piece of advice that you think everyone can benefit from?
the
Communication advice.
the communication advice that is most helpful, and I find that it works as well in parenting, in therapy, in business, with your partner, is what we call meta communication, or talking about talking. And there's a big difference between walking in and saying to your partner, like, I'm mad at you, and walking in and saying to your partner, I need to have a conversation with you about something I'm mad about. The idea is those little tags, those little tweaks go a long way towards keeping the people we're talking to regulated. Because when people are regulated, they're receptive and responsive. When they're dysregulated, they're harder to communicate, right? They get defensive, they shut down. I mean, how many times have you gotten a text from your boss like, hey, I need to talk to you at the end of the day? And you spend the rest of the day going, I'm gonna get fired. I'm gonna get fired.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
What's
get
that
fired.
about?
Yeah, right. You know, and my old boss was really good at sending me emails that would be like, "Hey," he's like, "I need to talk to you today. It's about your internship. It's about something I need you to do. Do not worry about it. You're standing here. This place is fine." Right. And it's, I don't know if you can ever be not anxious, but it was less anxious, right?
Hmm.
That's good meta communication. So, if you're in that leadership role and that's new to you, it's totally appropriate to say things like, "Hey, this is a stretch for me. This is hard," or like, "I've never had these kind of conversations before. I would welcome your feedback." Right? It lets people know that it's not a tiered power down conversation. There are elements of it that we can connect as equals. And when people feel connected, they engage more and you're going to have better conversations. So, if you ever listen to me like do therapy, I use a lot of meta communication. I'll like, "Hey, you know what? I love that we're talking about this thing. I need you to change the conversation to this other thing." Or I'll say to my kids, like, "I need to give you some tough feedback right now. And it's probably not going to feel very good, but it's coming from a place of love. Let me tell you why I need to tell you this," right? So the goal is not to make them, "Gee, Dr. Matt, I am being terrible to my parents. I'm glad you told me that. Yay!" Right? But if you can put context around those difficult words, people feel better. And when they feel better, they do better. And then we have better outcomes and we can move on with our lives. So meta communication is the strategy that seems to work really well.
I like it. We've also talked with other people on this show about just letting people know what you want out of a conversation before you
Mhm.
start it, so that they're not going in a different direction than what's actually needed. So talking about talking, I love it. All right, Matt, you're no longer Matthew, you're Matt. Where can people find out more about you and or reach out?
So I'm all over the interwebs. So for our therapy practice, it's the neurodiversitycollective.com. That's where myself and we have a wonderful team. We just hired some new people because there's just a lot of need out there. So if therapy is what you're looking for, the neurodiversitycollective.com. If you're like, "I like this guy, I like what he's saying, I think my company or my organization would benefit," it's drmattzakreski.com. And that's where, you can figure out how to get me to come to you and do these messages to a big room. And we have a really fun Facebook group, Dr. Matt Zakreski, I'm sorry, facebook.com/Dr. Matt Zakreski. It's nerd humor and neuroscience and psychology jokes and parenting and basically anything that dances across my beautiful brain. Um, and I'm lucky that I get to do a lot of podcasts. So, I mean, it's every so often I punch myself into Spotify. I'm like, how many things? Like, wow, that's a lot of names. So, if you liked what you heard, and bless you for that, you kind humans out there on the world, I am very findable. And, because when you love what you do, you want to do as much of it as you can.
That is wonderful. I am going to put a number of those links in the show notes so that it makes it even easier for people to find you. Matt, it has been such a pleasure. I really appreciate all of the insights you've shared with us. Thanks for joining.
Awesome. It was a true pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of How to Talk to Weirdos. Hopefully you found it both interesting and useful. If either of those things is true, please share. Do you have a friend or a coworker who could benefit from listening? Maybe a family member you're going to be spending the holidays with? Please send them a link to your favorite episode and see if your conversations don't get just a little bit easier. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much and have a great week.